This video is based on 2 research papers that are linked in the description box below. One explores the banning or suspending accounts on Twitter and the other how the algorithm promotes political content. It has been widely claimed by those on the political right in the United States that social media platforms are biased against conservatives. Many conservative activists, including former President Donald Trump, have filed lawsuits against social media companies, accusing them of censoring users with an anti-conservative bias. This view is shared by many Republican voters. For example, in an August 2020 poll, roughly 7 in 10 Republicans said major social media sites tend to favor liberals over conservatives. Allegations of platform bias against conservatives have become an important part of the American political landscape, as such allegations are now regularly used in the rhetoric of Republican politicians. Many social media companies are also very concerned about being perceived as having an anti-conservative bias, and such concerns may sway the decision-making of such companies. Yet these charges of political bias are based on anecdotal instances of particular platform actions, example, Twitter's permanent suspension of Trump's account, rather than any systematic evaluation of how rates of platform enforcement, such as account suspension, vary based on users' political orientations. Thus, it is unclear whether social media platforms are in fact more likely to suspend users that are conservative or Republican. Therefore, the researchers did an analysis of the suspension of 9,000 partisan Twitter users. The researchers found dramatic differences in suspension rates between Republican and Democratic users. Accounts that had shared the #Trump2020 hashtag during the election were 4.6 times more likely to have been subsequently suspended than those that shared the #VoteBidenHarris2020 hashtag. Specifically, while only 4.9% of the Democratic users had been suspended as of June 2021, 19.1% of the Republican users had been suspended. But could this apparent partisan difference be explained by suspension of users who spread misinformation, rather than political bias? Republican conservative were much more likely to share misinformation than users who were Democratic liberal. This was true when using a misinformation sharing measure generated by politically balanced crowds of laypeople, who, by virtue of being politically balanced, inherently cannot be accused of having an anti-conservative bias. Thus, policies aimed at fighting misinformation in a nonpartisan way could have easily led to the observed difference in suspensions of Republicans versus Democrats. This is particularly relevant in the context of the survey data collected, said the researchers. They found strong bipartisan support for social media companies taking action to reduce misinformation on their platforms, both in the abstract and specifically in the context of the QAnon conspiracy theory. However, they also found that Americans, and Republicans in particular, hold individuals to a different standard than social media companies. Being anti-QAnon is not seen as making a person anti-conservative by most respondents, but many do believe that reducing the spread of QAnon makes social media companies anti-conservative. This highlights the challenge social media platforms face in this historical moment where misinformation spreading is itself ideologically asymmetric. In sum, the observation that Republicans were much more likely to be suspended than Democrats does not provide evidence that Twitter was targeting users for suspension based on their politics. In the current hyper-partisan media ecosystem, partisanship is strongly confounded with the quality of information users share. Thus, Twitter's preferential suspension of Republicans could be entirely explained by a good faith, politically neutral effort to enact the bipartisan desire for reduced misinformation online, by, for example, suspending users sharing misinformation about QAnon. Now let's turn to the Twitter algorithm. Politicians and commentators from all sides allege that Twitter's algorithms amplify their opponents' voices, or silence theirs. Based on a massive-scale experiment involving millions of Twitter users, a fine-grained analysis of political parties in 7 countries, and 6.2 million news articles shared in the United States, the Twitter study carried out the most comprehensive audit of its algorithmic recommender system and its effects on political content. Following the research, Twitter admitted it amplifies more tweets from right-wing politicians and news outlets than content from left-wing sources. The social media platform examined tweets from elected officials in 7 countries, the UK, US, Canada, France, Germany, Spain and Japan. It also studied whether political content from news organizations was amplified on Twitter, focusing primarily on US news sources such as Fox News, The New York Times and BuzzFeed. The study compared Twitter's home timeline, the default way its 200 million users are served tweets, in which an algorithm tailors what users see, with the traditional chronological timeline where the most recent tweets are ranked first. The research found that in 6 out of 7 countries, apart from Germany, tweets from right-wing politicians received more amplification from the algorithm than those from the left. Right-leaning news organizations were more amplified than those on the left, and generally politicians' tweets were more amplified by an algorithmic timeline than by the chronological timeline. Twitter said it wasn't clear why its home timeline produced these results and indicated that it may now need to change its algorithm. A blog post by Rumman Chowdhury, Twitter's director of software engineering, and Luca Belli, a Twitter researcher, said the findings could be problematic and that more study needed to be done. The post acknowledged that it was concerning if certain tweets received preferential treatment not as a result of the way in which users interacted, but because of the inbuilt way the algorithm works. Recent arguments that different political parties pursue different strategies on Twitter may provide an explanation as to why these disparities exist. However, understanding the precise causal mechanism that drives amplification invites further study that the researchers hope their work initiates.